Hey there guys, I am the Sixth Machine and welcome back to another Warhammer video. Today we've had, amongst much gnashing and complaining, an FAQ for the recent Drukhari Codex. Now, before you get all excited about this super ridiculous, over-the-top 70% win rate, unbeatable faction getting nerfed into the ground, don't get too excited. This is a first initial FAQ release, and like we've seen with all of these throughout 9th edition so far, it's much more of just a tidying up, small clarification FAQ. There are none of the huge sweeping changes that I think some people believe the Drukhari need or deserve, so don't come away from this and just think that Games Workshop have ignored all the feedback and Drukhari are going to stay exactly the same for the next few years. I personally do think that Drukhari appear to be a bit too powerful for what you tend to pay for them, and I am 100% expecting things like Dark Technomancers to get addressed, as well as eventually some small increases on price of things like Raiders, but that will come at a later date. And it's also worth mentioning here, this is the Drukhari Codex FAQ, and one of the big offenders that people seem to be struggling with since the release of the Drukhari is the Razor Flail Competitive Edge Succubus, and that came about as a result of the Warzone Caradon book, which hasn't had an FAQ yet. And I think the fact that this hasn't had an FAQ yet, even though it came out the same day as the Drukhari Codex, does make me think that perhaps a few more bits of wording are being drafted for it to address that particular combo, because I do think that genuinely that is quite possibly the most overly quote-unquote broken thing in the Drukhari arsenal at the moment. But in any case, for now, let's take a look at the Drukhari FAQ and see what changes have been made. First up is a small change to Agile Hunters, the Witch Obsession. This used to state that you added 4 inches to the unit's move characteristic if you took the Hypex combat drug, and this now states that you add 3 inches instead of the usual 2. So it's a small nerf there, but nothing too obnoxious. I think it was clearly intended that that's how the interaction would work, and to be honest, it isn't one that I think many Drukhari players are looking at anyway, so I really don't think this is going to change anyone's gameplay or battle plan in a particularly big way. The Diabolical Soothsayer Warlord trait is next, just providing some clarification that you choose one of the 2 abilities the first time the model is set up on the battlefield, just to presumably avoid any interactions where they could go off the board and then be reset up again in a later turn. You can't then choose another one of the options, you are still stuck with the one you initially chose. Up next, we have a small addition to the Take Them Alive tactical objective. It's meant to state that you score victory points at the end of the battle round instead of the end of the battle, which it currently says. Once again, I think this is quite obvious, and clearly they just missed out a word when this was being written and printed. So again, just a nice little clarification there to make sure that people know exactly when they're meant to be scoring their victory points in a game. So nothing too big, but nice to have, and makes things a bit clearer for people using the codex as well as people playing against it. Another Warlord trait got an update in the Master Nemesin ability for the Homunculus Covenants. This has a slightly bigger change of wording, but one which does make a lot of sense in my opinion. Instead of now adding +1 to the Warlord's wounds roll, the ability now grants you rerolls of 1 when you wound. This seems like a slight nerf at first, until you realise that a large majority of the Homunculus Warlord's weapons actually have the poison 2+ rule, so granting a +1 to wound for those rolls does effectively nothing. In actual fact, the reroll ones that has now been changed to is a really nice little buff that means that pretty much all of your wounds will be going through to the enemy's save. So it is pretty tasty overall, even if in most circumstances, if you want a melee focused warlord or a damaging warlord, you're probably going to be looking at a succubus or an archon instead. Still, it is a nice little buff to the damage output of your Homunculus HQ choices, and I do like it. It does make sense. I'm glad GW sort of recognizes these interactions where you just think that actually doesn't really do anything at all, and are willing to fix it and amend it to make them actually have a purpose in the game. We also have a, let's be honest, very obvious change to the Reavers. They've been printed and corrected previously, going from the printed 10 points to the amended 20 points, and in the codex they again have the 10 points per model value it's obvious this isn't the right cost for them and would make them arguably the best model per point in the entire game. And I do think that 99% of people understand that and have been playing them at 20 points, especially in things like tournaments. But this is just a nice bit of clarification to set in stone that the 10 points really is a clear misprint. They did also take the opportunity to reduce the blaster cost from 15 points to 10, bringing it down by 5 points, which I think will help make it a bit more competitive with some of the other weapon options that the Reavers have access to, all of which range from either 5 to 10 points. So it puts a bit more competition towards things like Heat Lances as the ranged option for your squad of Reavers. Overall, I guess you could say this is technically a nerf to the Reavers, as they have doubled in points, but I mean, it isn't, really. They were obviously always meant to be 20 points, so yeah. If you played against anyone that tried to argue they were 10 points, because that's what the Codex says, you can now definitively tell them they were wrong, which is nice. Lastly, there's a question about the Animus vitae, which is a piece of war gear that states that if the bearer hits, the target suffers D3 or D3 plus 3 mortal wounds, but then it had an additional sentence that states friendly units treat the power of pain ability as one higher than it is currently. And the wording for this was just a little bit unclear. It wasn't quite... I don't think people were quite sure if that kind of second effect went off all the time as soon as you fired with the gun, but it is now confirmed that the second part only goes off on a successful hit. Which, I mean, yes, that seemed obvious to me, and I'm sure a lot of other people think that's just an obvious interaction, but it's nice to have an answer because having a look at the wording, it is slightly ambiguous because it's a separate sentence and it's a separate sort of clause. So some people could read that and think this is just an effect of the war gear and it happens whether or not you actually hit with the weapon or not, especially because it's a one use only piece of war gear. So I think some people just thought that was an effect that you always got once you fired it. Again, it's nice to just have the clarification so that any slightly ambiguous wording doesn't trip anyone up as they're having their games, because that's just no fun for anyone. So that's it. It's a relatively short FAQ so far, but as I said at the beginning, if you are a Drukhari player or someone who's been struggling against Drukhari opponents recently, there are almost certainly some more sweeping changes to come, in my opinion, either in the hopefully imminent Warzone Caradon FAQ or in a slightly more extended Drukhari FAQ. I think, honestly, GW have probably got a lot of feedback from players across the board about this codex, as it does seem to be quite universally agreed that there are some definite errors in how certain things interact within the codex, which definitely don't seem to be intended. And obviously in the past, it was the case that for unit price changes, you would tend to have to wait for the chapter approved at the end of the year. But based on this FAQ, it does seem like they are at least willing to change some. I mean, obviously the Reavers is an outlier of an example because it's clearly, obviously, massively wrong. But it does seem like in these FAQs, they are willing to at least look at unit prices in terms of points and maybe adjust them on the fly, which I do think the Drukhari do need to a degree. I certainly think that Raiders need a bit of a points bump, even if it's only 15 or 20 points, just to make them a bit more, or a bit less, I suppose, a bit less spammable. But what do you think of this FAQ? Do you think the changes here all make sense? And what else are you looking forward to see in terms of changes in the Warzone Caradon and any future Drukhari FAQs? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me. But until next time, I will catch you later, guys.